I'd like to introduce Philippe Rekacewicz. His presentation is called Cartography Between Art and Politics. Philippe, as Rasha Ikoy already said, and I mentioned as well, is part of the Research in Progress presentation we have in the new building. He has made an amazing map that traces the connections, influences, cultural and economic through a map, through a cartography of the connections and the influence of Soviet Union that has with Asia, Africa and Arab countries. And that was, a very difficult task. And I think today he will expand a little bit first on, on that concrete project, and then more about, more in general about how actually important and politically relevant cartography can be today. Just a little bit about him. He was born in France in 1960. He's a journalist, geographer, and cartographer with a specialism in geopolitics and international relations. Research interests include questions relating to migration, refugees, forced displacement of populations and borders. From 1988 to 2014, he worked at Le Monde, and between 1996 and 2008, he headed in parallel the cartographic department of GRID-Arendal, a decolonized office of United Nations Environment Programme. He is presently working on several socio-geographic projects on the creation of public and private space and the perception and representation of borders. Rekacewicz is keenly interested in the relationship between cartography, art, science, and politics. Since 2006, he has participated in the cartographic-artistic projects in a number of European countries. He is also currently conducting research into radical cartography, and maybe he will tell a little bit more about what this means. Thank you.
I was waiting for the image. So, thank you very much. I will be conveying you in another dream fabric. Cinema is a dream fabric. And you will see here in, I hope, 30 minutes, that cartography is a sort of dream fabric as well. And the status of cartography is not as obvious as we think it is. So I will invite you to this journey into mapping, into cartography. My duty, my role in this exhibit was to put the project into a context, into a historical, geographical, geopolitical context. So we will come back to this, and I will defend the choice we have done for the map which is present in the exhibition. But before that, I will invite you to on a reflection on the presence of cartography in the world of art, so to speak. So, cartographics. You see here, I on purpose made a fusion between the word art and cartography because the relationship between the two is not extremely straightforward and clear. Are maps legitimate in museum? Are maps an object of art? That's a question. The debate, anyway, lasts since few centuries already, and we have no answer, and we will not find an answer today about that. But it is legitimate to ask the question, if a map is an object of art or an object of science, or both of it. So we can say that the map is definitely an object of science because it is produced after mathematics formula and algorithms, but it's also very obvious that the map is definitely an object of art because it's produced with forms, with lines, with surface, movements, colors, more or less intense, contrast, textures. In other words, all graphic elements which is used as a mean of art. And then since long we think about, for example, the ancient map from the 16th and 17th century. They were an object of power, but they were an object of art. And each of those maps were the opus of a life's cartographer at that time. They needed 5, 10, 15 years to produce just one map, which was depicting the kingdom and the territories which were under the control of the sovereign. So this very question is pretty difficult to answer, as the famous question, when is an object becoming a piece of art? So we can ask the question, when a map has become a piece of art. I think it has always been, because using colors, forms, etc. But it has been more or less forgotten at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and it's only since 1 or 2 decades that art curators, contemporary modern art curators, were suddenly interested in cartography as an element that could help to renew the world of what we can call the political art, let's call it like that. So either an artist will use a map for its aesthetical quality. For example, Matthew Kusick has no political will or specific political message to convey. This is an American artist using maps for the beauty of it, for the aesthetical aspect of it. As a detailed, and as the ancient cartographer, Matthew Kusick spent days and months and years for producing just one of his artwork, composed of hundreds of thousands pieces of road map cut for doing those tableaus. Either the cartographer used the mean of art to better convey its political message, and this is where it's becoming more interesting. So to answer the growing interest of curators for this form of expression at the crossing point of science, art, and politics. And who says politics means many more. Expression of power, engagement, activism. And yes, in this context, cartography could efficiently serve what could be called political art, because you convey a political message. A map is already a political act, so why not putting the cartography into the political art? As we are going to see in the few samples I'm going to present to you now. And this political act is obviously well and often expressed in modern thematical traditional cartography, the conventional cartography, the one that you used to see in books, in newspaper, but very newly and even much better expressed, with more impact and possibly with more brutality, in what we call political art. And when we want to express something political through art, it's much more easy, because we had a discussion this morning in the taxi with my colleague, and of course the politicians, those which would be afraid of the message and of the information you would display publicly, through an object of science, a book or a newspaper, an article. When it comes to the museum, to the art gallery, they don't take us seriously, so you can do much more, and you can convey much more of information which are potentially sensitive and potentially being censored in a way. First of all, the map, as we see it, is a real symbol of an identity, a logo. It's like a flag, finally. The form of a country, in many countries, and especially in authoritarian countries, are the logo are an object of a holy object of representation, which can be understood as a fusion of your own identity. You have a country, and if you from the external world, if you're not Korean, or if you're not Moroccan, or if you're not French, and if you draw badly the country or the contour of the country, for example, if you represent only half of the Korean peninsula, this is a political act, this is a political decision, and this can be taken as an offense, just the fact that you would draw differently a country than the official way that the power itself sees itself. As a political art, mapping exercise is therefore an open door to manipulation and propaganda, because the map is never faithful to the reality. It's not a representation of the reality. It looks like it is, but it is not. This is a vision. This is a representation of what we think the reality or how we see the world, the communities, and how we understand the way human communities organize, grab, or produce their territories. There is no such thing as an innocent map. There is no such thing as an innocent map, just because behind each map there is an intention. They are subjective. They are never represent the reality. They always represent what we want to see, what we understand with our culture, our philosophy, our fundamental values, our education. An object of power, of course, it's not new that authoritarian and dictator were interested by cartographic representations, because who is in the control of the territory, the control of the image of the territory, is on control of the territory itself. And the symbol is also, of course, that the form of the country itself is, has to be identified and recognized as an object which is becoming part of the culture, whatever we think about this. The map is a filtered element. Between the data and the final image, there is a human being in between. He's called the cartographer. He has its own sensibility, artistic, politic, philosophic, and its own knowledge, and its own limits, of course. The maps that are provided and printed are therefore not representing the exact reality, as we say, but an interpretation of it. And it is anyway impossible to represent exhaustively all what is on the territory, just on a small sheet of paper, A4 format. Of course, the mapping exercise will require to sacrifice a part of the information. The cartographer will operate some very difficult choices and must keep, in his opinion, the most relevant elements to be represented. And we'll see at the end of the presentation how we have chosen the element we were representing on the final map that is coming to explain the geopolitical context of the exhibit. Then, dealing much more with ideologies rather than more or less neutral representation. This is a chimera of what is happening under my eyes is the reality. I was for very long convinced that I would be mapping fact, geography, reality. And finally, after a few years, I have discovered that I was just mapping political approaches, mental understanding of territories, and ideologies. And the word ideologies will come back here because what we map is, generally speaking, ideologies. In other terms, to conclude, is a map a simple representation of the reality or the expression of a political will or point of view? Map as power. So, of course, reality and imaginary, I tend to think the map as a permanent dialogue between reality and imaginary because we get inspiration into the reality. We are mapping real fact, but we are mapping real fact with our eyes, with all the filters which separates our eyes from the scene. A sort of meeting point between the abstraction and the realism. So you see here, we are making map out of data, either they are quantitative or qualitative. We are the filter, the manipulation area, to produce a final image, which is usually nothing to see with the primary data and the primary reality. It's interpreted, of course. And when I say also a crossing point or a meeting point between the abstraction and the reality, even though you draw the coastline, the countries, in a way you recognize it because you know it, because you have seen satellite images or you have seen atlases. This is like this painting of Albert Marquet, where you have the impression that you see buses, that you see snow, that you see people. But this is not people, this is not snow, it's not a horse. This is just a black line. This is a fusion. This is where the abstraction meets the realism. It's an evocation. The map is exactly like the painting of Albert Marquet. This is always an evocation of things. Here you have a map, which is also an evocation of things. And if I give you a title of this map, you will understand it immediately because you are trained for that. Map as a power, short story. This story happened in the 16th century, and I will try to make you understand what was the function of a map in the 16th century, as the function of the map today is the same. We are in the 16th century in Portugal, in Lisbon. The map has disappeared. The map? Yes, master. The one which the king has commissioned from you. Not leaving time for Alberto Contino to catch up with him, the master cartographer understood instantly the scale of the catastrophe. 2 months previously, the king has passed down the command to him, henceforth, recognized by the Pope as a lord of the conquest, navigation, and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India, the sole sovereign with mastery of the maritime routes leading to the land of spices, he desired to have constantly presented to his view the extent of his empire, to be imbued with it so thoroughly as to make decisions in conformance to his commercial and religious responsibilities. And this scene takes place in Lisbon in 1502, beginning of 16th century, in a very gripping narration of historical romance. So it's a French historian, Gérard Vint, which is telling the theft of this cartographical studio of the Royal Planisphère, the only one of its kind, just a unique example of the map, sample of the map, upon which are represented the world from Indies to Brazil, designed for the first time according to the observations brought back by surveys done by the navigators Pedro Alvarez Cabral and Don Vasco da Gama. And the loss, the disappearance of this map, unique, where he had full control of the world in a way, but just the disappearance of the map. The world is the same. The map is considered as a state secret, but he experienced a genuine economic disaster and he's losing his power. He will be deprived of access to his resource because he will not see it anymore. Who possesses the map, who possesses the geographical information, who possesses this knowledge of the location, has the power. If this disappears, the power disappears. So now, we are going through a few examples to illustrate this ambiguity between on cartography between if maps is an object of science and an object of art, and what we can do with it, but it has to see when we think the map as a political object, a political art object, that it is an open door to manipulation of propaganda. So this first short lesson will be both using a little bit science and a little bit of art. To produce a map with any thing which is measurable in volumes, here we speak about number of refugees by country, is produced scientifically with an abacus. This abacus is called Lenz-César abacus, and here I have produced the size of the sphere with a statistical theory which is the same. But what I have changed here, and you have the right to do, is the height scale. And you see here that for the same number, this is, the same numbers, each of the statistical theory are scientifically built. It's not discussed, you can't discuss it, it's scientific. But the visual effect is very different. Application. If you draw a map by the refugee by country, I have drawn 5 maps with 5 height scale different. And you have this result. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Reverse, 4, 3, 2, 1. The effect is very different. The choice of the size, this is the same numbers, the 5 maps are legitimate. They are legitimate. They are built scientifically with this abacus. The choice of the size is a political act. Either you think the refugees is not a problem in the world, and you would choose this representation. Either you want to make it spectacular, and you would choose this. Representation of war. Do we think war is a global problem, or do we think war is a regional problem? All representation that we find tend to show us that there is a concentration of countries of war, as you see here, that spread between Africa and South Asia. But is that the whole picture? And this is what we eat. This is what is being served to us. But you don't have the full picture. And if you get the full picture, you will have that. So what is that? The green circles here represents the export of arms by volumes. We speak about hundreds of billions of dollars. And suddenly, from a regional problem, where you see the war is on other place, the war is in Africa or in Asia, it doesn't concern us. But when you see this, you understand that we are not anymore in a regional problem, but we are in a world problem. Another way to show the war, at the same time I will show also the approach by sketch and by finalization, is to choose a way a little bit less spectacular to represent the relationship between the countries in war and between the what we see here with this the red line, the external protagonists, the foreign intervention, which is basically the rich country and the developed country providing armaments. Now, to come back to the world of art, I would like to present some few projects, which is very similar to the project I will finish with this presentation, and which is definitely precipitating us in a world of imaginary, in a world of dream, with this series called The World Seen From. There was a big wall called Le Monde vu d'eux in French, The World Seen From, trying to make understand that we all have our own look at things. And here, the cartographer is just a gray man. He's just going to each of those cities and interviewing the people on how they think the country appear in the regions where they are. You go, for example, here in Cairo. And this is a sketch zero. The cartographer is drafting, drawing, writing all what he's hearing from the people. He's the gray man. And at the end, he will interview 10 people and have an object, a final object, which is a map, which is not depicting the reality, but the way the people perceive their own country. They are all people from Egypt, and this is the way they perceive their own country. And this perception is completely different of what we are used to see. Closer to us, a little trip to Warsaw, Varsovie. And again, we interviewed 10 people in Warsaw. What are their fears? How do they see themselves? 2 nightmares and 1 dream. And they are clearly still living in what I can call a historical trauma with this Poland shared 4 times between Russia and Germany. And this is what appears here. And this is first sketch is a synthesis of the interview of the people. This is a sketch 0 for having a last picture of the way, it's not the picture of Poland in Europe, but it's the way how Poland sees itself and fear its neighbors. The dream is United States, it is this blue arrow, and the fear is Germany and Russia. This is not me who is seeing that. This is the Polish people which are interviewed, which are here depicting the way they see themselves, squeezed in between 2 threats with a buffer zone. I will not develop more because we don't have more time, and I would like to speak a little bit about the map of the exhibit also. But more important to finish this second part is how we would conceive and what is the approach, the cartographic approach, to go from the intellectual idea. I assume the map is before everything an intellectual construction, to the final idea. And this is what I call the sketch zero and the invention of the world. The cartographer has this power that he can invent its world. In a way, this is what we have done for the exhibit. We have invented the world, or we have, let's be more fair. This world was existing, it's based on reality, speaking of the map of the exhibit, but we have rehabilitated a vision that was invisible since decades. Let's say that we have we made visible something which remained for years invisible. So the sketch zero looks like this, and you will tell me this is not a map, but this is a map. I can tell you, this is Japan, this is Korea, this is Russia, this is Central Asia, this is India, and here this is the oil, this is the transportation. This is a geopolitical map. This is just the idea of the map. This is the first transcription of the intellectual idea, the mental idea of the map to the paper. And of course, you have a high level of idea when you do this, and then when you draw it, you're very disappointed. And this is why it's called sketch zero. And after we go through a sketch number one, which is a little improvement of the sketch zero, but it's based on the same things, but it's still extremely chaotic and messy. But at least it's geographized. We put it into the geography anymore, and then we start to structure a legend, which is going to be a typology. This is the sketch number two, but we have not finished to invent this world seen from Tokyo, and we have to clean a little bit more the map with the sketch number three, the sketch three here, where you start to recognize a little bit more the logic of this geopolitic, to finally have produced a sketch number four, which is back at the level of the first idea that you have. So this is basically the process that is applied on each cartographic intention, let's call it like that, or cartographic ideas that we have. How many minutes or seconds do I have?
You have 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because we also have to speak a little bit of... Now, let's go a little bit more further into the world of what I call the dream fabric of cartography. With this other artistic project, which is really also at the crossroad of the science, the politics, the art, the techniques, geography of plenty, geography of empty. As we live in a world where the inequity is growing more and more, and the problem is to try to depict, to draw, to visualize the extent, the volume, the distance between, for example, the very poor and between the very rich. Because if I say it like that, there is rich people and poor people. I think everybody understands that there is poor people starving and rich people having everything. But what you don't understand, what you don't know, is the real volume of this distance, the real extent of it. And going through the parameter, going through the indicators, the criteria, we realize that if we want to draw inequity, discrimination, we finally draw a geography of plenty and a geography of empty. So how do we do that? We do this through a metaphoric image. Here is the planet system, and each of the planet represents an indicator. For example, here you have the world GNP, $62,000 billion, and each circles are proportional. Here, this blue one, this is the trade, the world trade for a year, export-import, $15,000 billion. And here you have the stock exchange capitalizations. It's nearly $60,000. It's equivalent to the GNP. And then you have this enormous planet around which all those indicators are turning around. And this is speculative product in the stock exchange. It means this is movement of money which are at the very external border of legality. And it represents $720,000 billion. And I'm sure that none of you are able to understand what this money means. By comparison, here you have a very small one, which is criminality activities according to the UN. $1,000 billion. And what were striking us when we were doing this is that what you have here is, at the end, an illegal circulation of money, because this is pure speculation. And most of it is at the edge, at the margin of being illegal. And you hear what the UN, the international community, calls illegal, represents only $1,000 billion, which is already a lot, but doesn't include this. And of course, all what is here isn't, or will never be in water and sanitation providing for the people. This could, all problems of health and education that could be solved pretty easily if the money would be just transferred in another side. Another way to, also in an artistic way to make understand what is the difference would be, for example, this installation, which was meant to be 5 meters on 5 meters, and here is just the layout of it. And we start by this very small black dot here. You don't see it, but you have to trust me. And this black dot here, this is one family. It's the Walton family. I'm very happy to introduce this Walton family. See, there are 5, 6. Christy, Jim, Alice, Samuel, Robson, Anne, Laurie, Walton. And they own one of the largest supermarket chain in the United States and in the world. And in 2013, they had as an annual revenue $172 billion. So what is that represents for one family? And we have to find an element of comparison. So they are Americans. So what I thought was to try to find what was the average revenue for a normal American family of 5 to 6 persons, $76,000. So I thought, how many families do you need to have an equivalent of the fortune, of the wealth of this Walton family? The answer is simple. It's just a multiplication. 2,267 families. It means roughly 11 million people. And this is the equivalent of the whole agglomeration of Chicago, city plus the neighborhood. It means that just one family in the United States, the richest one, has a wealth which is the complete equivalent to what 11 million people, a whole city of Chicago, is earning. And maybe by this way, this is an experiment project, but by those experiment projects, you can understand much better the extent of the distance that you can find in those indicators. If we draft a graphic of GNP in the world, for example, for the 15 richest country or for the 15 poorest country, one graphic will be totally full and the other graphic will be completely empty, and we will, of course, people will tell me this graphic is totally useless because it's empty. You don't see the column because they are so thin. But here we are approaching a cartographic concept of the emptiness, the nothing, the white. And very often in cartography or in graphic, the nothing has a very important signification. So now we will finish directly with the map of the exhibit. And we, of course, speak here about perception, about representation. It's a subject which is pretty difficult to introduce because it's multivariate. There is many different parameters you have to consider together when you do this geopolitical concept, because there is, so to speak, the reality, what has happened, what was Soviet Union, what was the world, what was the relationship between Soviet Union and the Western world and the Third World, and the way it was represented, the way it was perceived from the West and the way it was perceived from the Soviet part, and also what was denied, in a way. The idea was to give this geopolitical context to the exhibit, and that was a pretty important challenge to choose the right intention, so to speak. So we have seen how highly sensitive and definitely different was the perception we all have, Western, Soviet, and even Third World, of the environment, the territory, the living space, and the difficulty here we have to choose between various radically different options. Let's start by what was the vision from the Western side. And very often, so you have three actors in this theater play, so to speak. Theater play is the world. There is a two-block system, more or less. It's more complex, but let's call it like that. And this two-block system was practically always in the Western world represented this way. Blue color, very peaceful, very nice for the nice guys in a way for the Western world, and the red, very threatening, and the bad guys for all what was communist, socialist, and especially representing the Soviet Union. And the third actor, which is, we are very interested, is the third world, Africa, Arab world, Middle East, and Asia, which in all of those maps are considered as a terrain of competition for the two big blocks. No more than that. It's a deny of the people in a way. More interesting here was this representation of what was the American threat seen by the Soviets in the 50s, 60s. And here again, there is a two-block system. To be fair, it's not the Soviet vision, it's more the Western vision as they thought the Soviets were seeing them. But here again, you see that a part of China, the rest of the third world was totally denied, totally outside of the picture. It's not even on the map, there is nothing there. And the same things when you take it from the Soviet threat seen by the Americans, here it's even worse than that. There is nothing, there is no threat, nothing. The Africa, Asia, Arab world doesn't exist. So this has led us into the research, into some archives here in Moscow, and consultation of some maps drawn by the Soviet cartographers at the times, where they were seeing things a little bit differently, like this. It's one of the numerous maps where they were definitely not interested anymore, so it's the other way around, the complete deny of the Western world, and even the China, for emphasizing how the Soviet Union were seeing it in its relationship to the third world, with very pale color, bit paternalistic, and they were seeing these regions not as a regions to exploit, although Soviet Union didn't need any raw material at the time because there was everything available there. So the reason why Soviet Union had a relationship with this third world was others. But here, you see that this representation, which is mainly the representation we find in Soviet atlases between 60s and 80s, is much more, almost I would have said sweet, much more peaceful. They're not seeing this world as a world of confrontation, but as a world of exchange, cultural exchange, trade exchange. Of course, in the trade, they are also selling arms, so it's not extremely peaceful. But what is important is not so much the reality, but it's the way they were representing themselves. They were the way that Soviet cartographers were projecting themselves in the world. And this is it. So now we come to the map itself as we have decided to publish it. The relationship between Soviet Union and the rest of the world has been, unfortunately, almost represented as a confrontation with the Western world. Using the two colors and using a pretty brutal number of visual representation modes. And the third world, as you have seen on those maps, were always represented as, at the best, a field of geopolitical competition, at the worst, nothing. And this idea has led us to misunderstand really what was the relationship between Soviet Union and the rest of the third world, Africa, Arab world, and India. And at least in the French scholar books, but also in many other school books in Europe, the ideological aspect of the relationship, the idea that Soviet Union was exporting not only armaments, but also ideology, a model of society, supporting or building socialist initiative, or guerrilla or resistance movement. This has been totally denied in our books, in the school books, in the Western world, in the United States. Minimized, for not saying denied, actually. So this was definitely a question of perception. While the exchange we have seen during the research period was very important. So this is the choice we have done to downsize a little bit what was the relationship with America and Europe. Although Europe was playing a role of middleman or middle continent here, because there was important relationship that was happening in Europe, just because in Europe you had some former colonialist country like France, for example, which played a role, an important role in sending or not sending students and professionals studying in Soviet Union and the European socialist countries. So altogether, what is represented here is a triptych. It shows a situation both at the geographical level and at the historical level. And here we are also playing a little bit a confusion between abstraction and realism, because the height of the column is saying something about the intensity of the relationship. But it's the intensity of everything, of the cultural exchange, of student exchange, of engineer exchange, of support, building big dam industries, for example. This is what we would call an index. We have really seen all the indicators. We made a synthesis of these indicators. So you could not, with such a map, go very much in detail. But what you can do, you can have a global view of what was important and what was the relationship which were emphasized, which was threatened by Soviet Union and the other countries. And this is one. So this is really the relationship. And here you will see the map in the museum with the kind of relationship it had with Europe, for the internationals especially, but also some relationship of movement of independence and emancipation especially. The second aspect of this triptych is a focus. And now we are just speaking about only students in cinema that has been traveling from the countries to either Moscow or Kiev or where you had the School of Cinema here, to understand what was the volume of those students. And of course, this is imperfect data. We are missing some of the data, but let's say that this is the least worst data we have for doing this. And the third, so here we have a focus showing a geographical, it's not historical, but it is a geographical distribution of where the students were going to Moscow. And the third part of this triptych represents one indicator among a lot that we had. We had indicators showing what was the commercial trade between Soviet Union and the countries between 1950 and 1990. There was many different criteria we could have chosen, and I thought that it would be interested, and those data were pretty difficult to gather, but we managed somehow to map what was the volume, the level of exchange of conventional armaments between 1950 and 1990. And you will see, you can guess a little bit here. We are here in 1990, here in 1950, 1990, that the interest for Soviet Union and the agreement, the political agreement for Soviet Union has been changing a long time. And just with this graphic, you could deeply dive into the history of each country's relationship with Soviet Union. You know that Egypt at the moment were provided by hugely by Soviet Union, and then they changed camp and they turned toward United States, while some other countries entered in the landscape. And here, finally, just by these indicators, indirectly, you could probably redraw the history of what was the relationship of all of those countries, which were actually the countries important for the study of this movie maker traveling in Moscow. So that was the choice that we have done, and to avoid speaking about Australia or about America and Europe too much, because this was not very interesting. But here, I would say that this cartographic composition gather pretty comprehensively what a map could be, with a vertical and horizontal approach. This is geographical. You have here the historical dimension, the geographical dimension, and the criteria dimension. We speak about cultural exchange, trade exchange, student exchange. We speak about armament exchange. We speak about the evolution between 1950 and 1990, and the intensity of the relationship. There is also a volume issue here, the level of intensity of the relationship between the Soviet Union, Moscow, and the rest of the country. One word to finish on the design of it. The color chosen are not there by a coincidence. First of all, I try to remain pretty faithful to what I have seen in the archives here, in the numerous atlases that show how Soviet cartographers were perceiving themselves and what color they have chosen. When you put a color on a map, it's never by coincidence. It's never because you just have a red pen here. You choose it because the color has a signification. So this is roughly the colors that you find: pale blue, pale yellow. But there is also another reason. This is also to dive into the world of designer, painters, and Soviet graphists. And I choose two, also not by coincidence, and you will recognize here the yellow ochre and the blue and the gray, with this extremely interesting opus by Vladimir Sternberg, which gave the idea of the set of color. You have the color, and I said a map is color, lines, movement, and the movement is here. This is this Lisitsky. I think everybody knows Lisitsky, with this fantastic opus, The New Man, which has given, so I don't say the map is looking like Lisitsky, but it has at least given the inspiration. We have to be fair and always quote the source of inspiration, so this is too very important, for the movement of it and for the form of it. Which gives, it's very subtle, it's very elegant, it's very thin, and I thought that we had to be also faithful to this, faithful to what was the representation in the atlas, and faithful to these two things here. And to finish this, we'll come back on something a little bit more universal. I want to recall that the three fundamental elements with which you draw map. This is point, which are joining lines on surfaces. And this approach has not been developed by any cartographers. It has been developed by an artist. In 1923, Kandinsky, point et ligne sur plan, point and line on surface, translated from Russian in 1923 at the time. This book, this approach, has been the complete fundamental starting point for all thematical cartographers after, for understanding how we should organize those cartographic composition. Thank you very much, and if you have questions, I think it's now.